May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may proceed.
This is not a murder. Now, it is undisputed that Vanessa Sullivan lost her life in the early morning hours of September 25th, 2010. Nothing we can say or do here today can bring her back. This was an accident. And with accidents and things of this tragic nature, oftentimes emotions come into play. But your job as a jury is to set aside your emotions. Set aside those emotions we feel, the sympathy we feel for Vanessa Sullivan and her family, and look at just the facts. Now, the prosecution has the burden of proof. They must prove to you, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Danny Dawson did recklessly murder Vanessa Sullivan while under the influence of alcohol on the night of September 24th, 2010. We, the defense, have no such burden. Now, in order for the prosecution to prove to you that Danny Dawson murdered Vanessa Sullivan, he must have shown an extreme indifference to human life. Now let's look, what is extreme indifference? Well, let's look first at what being reckless is. Being reckless is taking your car, looking down an empty road, seeing no one there, closing your eyes, and driving down it. That's being reckless. Now let's look at what showing extreme indifference is, a step above that. Extreme indifference is to look down a road, not empty this time, but filled with people, closing your eyes and driving down that road anyways. Danny Dawson did not exhibit extreme indifference on that night. Now, the prosecution has brought forth 3 witnesses today. First witness, Officer Foster, who performed the field sobriety tests on the defendant. We heard from Officer Foster that he nearly slipped that night himself. One of those field sobriety tests was a heel-to-toe test. Officer Foster could hardly perform that. We also heard from Officer Foster that during these field sobriety tests, Vanessa Sullivan's mother was there, screaming at Danny Dawson, screaming that she would make his life a living hell. It's no wonder that Danny Dawson, who had just been in this collision, could not perform these tests under such stressful circumstances. Next witness that we heard from, the prosecution brought forth, Pat Lawrence, who had just started working at Chuggy's that night. We heard from Pat Lawrence that he didn't even see all of the drinks consumed by Danny Dawson that night. He was busy running around waiting at other tables. We also heard that he did not see Danny Dawson consume any ADD pills that he alleged. Lastly, we heard from Taylor Hobson, who was in the car during the accident. Now, Taylor Hobson, we learned, doesn't even remember all the drinks she herself drank that night, let alone what Danny Dawson was drinking. She doesn't know her limits with alcohol. We also heard from Taylor Hobson that she was in the back seat during the accident and wasn't exactly sure what was going on. Now let's look at the witnesses that the defense brought forth. We heard from Leslie Roman about the accident itself. Let's look at that accident. Here's the diagram that Leslie Roman used in talking about the accident. In his conclusions, the accident that Danny Dawson was driving, he performed an evasive maneuver, like a jerk, to get out of the road, as we see here, and then overcorrected to get back in the road after jerking. And then, due to the downgrade in the road, he was pulled into a utility pole and then a tree, and this caused the death of Vanessa Sullivan. We heard from London Bennett, who lives on Canyon Road where the accident occurred, that her dog, Peaches, who she described for us as only barking when animals are present, was barking that night, just moments before the accident. Now we heard from Jordan James, who is the bartender at Chuggy's, has been for 2 years, has known Danny Dawson, that Chuggy's is infamous for pouring their drinks weaker than an average drink. That Danny Dawson asked for his drinks to be poured stronger so they can be equal to an average drink anywhere else. We also heard from Jordan James that Danny Dawson was popular at that bar and would order drinks for other people. So he did not consume all the drinks on his bar tab. Let me also remind you that we have no BAC for Danny Dawson that night. We have no way to know what his blood alcohol content was. All we know is based on those bar tabs, which we heard from Jordan James are not even a true depiction of what he actually consumed that night. The prosecution has failed to meet their burden. They have not shown that Danny Dawson murdered Vanessa Sullivan while under the influence of alcohol, because there is too much reasonable doubt. Let me remind you that when there are two explanations, one pointing to the guilt of the defendant, one pointing to his innocence, and if there's any doubt as to which could be either, you are instructed to find the explanation that shows the innocence of the defendant. Because though as sad as this accident was, and as much as we feel for Vanessa Sullivan's family, this was not a murder. We ask you to find the defendant not guilty. Thank you.